Good afternoon. Now, on the third time, you just absolutely have to listen. Good afternoon. Thank you. Now I know that you heard me. Okay. So welcome back to the Schemmel, one and all. I feel a little more justified today in welcoming you to the spring semester, as the Arctic weather appears to be behind us, at least long enough for me to use the term spring, and it feels very springy. It's always a pleasure to bring back to the Schemmel Forum one of our nation's most distinguished journalists to enlighten us on current world affairs. We know that it's not fake news, and we can be fairly sure that it won't be good news. But we are obliged as citizens to know what is going on so that we can do our share in improving conditions. That's part of our job. We need to hear from Trudy in what can be called fairly critical times. We need to hear from a hard-edged, straight-talking journalist about this administration's take on foreign policy. Is there one? If so, how does it affect us and our status in the world? What is the impact of the 2018 elections? Trudy has special expertise on some of the toughest spots in the world. She's visited them in their worst of times and has contacts with top officials whose thoughts she can mine so that people like us in our safe havens get to know the real story. We can ask her about any trouble spot in the world. Today she will be focused on us, our America, our relations to other nations. Who are our friends? Who are our foes? And what is foreign policy, is there, if there is one? And what is the impact of the 2018 elections? Please join me in welcoming Trudy Rubin back to the Schemmel Forum.
Thanks so much, Sandra. It's lovely to be back here. I'm so glad the weather was good so people didn't need to suffer getting here. And I can even get a suntan while sitting here if you're in the right seat. When talking about U.S. foreign policy, or should we say Trump foreign policy, for the coming year and what to watch for, what crises to expect, there's, I think, an unusually lively set of possibilities that one needs to lay out. As you all know, this is a deliberately unconventional president, and this makes his foreign policy especially hard to predict, although patterns are emerging. And it also means that one can't be certain in which direction he will go on specific issues because, as we all know, he can change his mind very rapidly. And what makes this all the more sort of unsettling, I guess I'd say, is that his style of leadership is occurring at a time when, as we all know, very much in the world is in transition, not just in foreign policy terms, and the role of the U.S. is shifting. Even were Trump not president, one probably would see substantial changes because the world is shifting, technology is shifting, China is rising, Europe is cracking, and so there are all these changes taking place anyway, apart from the issue of how Trump conducts foreign policy. I was looking at a book that I've had on my shelf for a long time by Dean Acheson, who was Secretary of State under Harry Truman. And when I was looking at the introduction, it fascinated me because he was writing about the fact that when the Truman administration came into its own, when Truman was actually elected, as opposed to the period when he had taken over from FDR after FDR's death, the country and the world were in a period of transition. And Atchison said, we were operating in a framework where we really did not know what the world was going to look like in several years' time. We were flying blind. We had to create it. As we went along, we had to guess, we had to surmise, because the world changed totally in those years after World War II. And I feel like we're in an era, a similar era now, not an era perhaps that is going to be defined by the kind of wars that we saw in the last century, World War I, World War II, or even defined by international terrorism, which has been the big threat on the horizon ever since 9/11, but in many ways defined by two things, the rise of China and shifts in technology, and the two are not unlinked, in fact they are linked, shifts in technology that are going to change the way the world operates and make our increasingly computer-driven systems very vulnerable to the new form of warfare, which is going to be cyber war and cyber espionage. So what I'm going to do is talk a little about the general factors that I think are going to affect foreign policy in this coming year, and then look at some of the specific foreign policy challenges that I think will be front and center. I think a good place to start, is in the open set to one-sided exchange of insults between Trump and his intelligence chiefs that took place last week when they testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee. As you know, the president has been speaking about the wall as if it were the greatest national emergency, security emergency facing us. And we all know that isn't true. Statistically, it's an issue. It's a challenge. It could be resolved in a bipartisan fashion. We all know that there was a bipartisan package that was put together in Congress in 2013 that would have provided $26 billion for security on the southern border, and that was not pursued because of political reasons. So I think that it was very telling that when the intel chiefs were speaking, it was not until almost the end of the presentation, which was done by Dan Coates, the Director of National Intelligence, which is the agency that is the umbrella over all of our intelligence agencies. It was not until he was almost finished with his remarks that the word border was introduced, and it was only in one sentence in which he talked about drugs, and most drugs do not come through the border in remote places. When they come through the border, they usually come at legal points of entry, and they're smuggled in by cars or whatever. Anyway, in the report that the Intelligence Committee submitted, the annual threat assessment, it was the same thing. The border was only mentioned on page 18 and in only one sentence. But the threats that the intel chiefs focused on, front and center, was cyber war, and I'm going to get back to that. Then they were looking at Russia and China, both individually and together, since those two countries are more and more entering into an alliance of convenience, which is mostly aimed at working together against the United States, because in actual fact, Russia knows that China wants to and is eating its lunch and maybe will be eating a lot of its territory someday. And the Chinese are tremendously disdainful of the Russians if you go to China and you talk to officials who, if they'll speak frankly, admit that. The other threats that were high on the list were North Korea, which still has all of its nuclear weapons and where there's been no progress on denuclearization. I'll get back to that. And the question of Iran. You know, further down and not on the top grouping were Syria, Afghanistan, the remnants of our wars past, Venezuela in passing, but this is not a prime security threat. This is an intervention of choice. So that's the way the security chiefs look at the threats that we're going to be facing. When I look at this coming year, 2019, and I think of foreign policy challenges, the first thing I think of is President Trump himself. I recently wrote a column in which I listed what I thought were the top issues that we'd face. And then there were 5, and then at the end I came to, but maybe the biggest issue is the psyche of President Trump. Because, and I say this, I can say in a nonpartisan fashion, I've been very critical of Trump in my columns, so people might not believe that, but I think that President Trump is running his foreign policy in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime, and even strong foreign policy presidents, say, like Richard Nixon, who worked closely with a small team of advisors, mostly Henry Kissinger, and who held foreign policy close to their chest, you can't make a comparison. Because Nixon was well-versed in foreign policy, he could handle himself overseas in China, and in Kissinger, whether you loved him or hated him, you could not deny that this was a man with an astonishing grasp of international affairs. That's not the case with President Trump. I think we have seen in his first 2 years that the way he prefers, the way he chooses to handle foreign policy is through one-on-one meetings with powerful figures, preferably autocrats, because I think he sees in autocrats a parallel to the way he sees himself. Just as he ran a family business, and he made the decisions, he had a few family members around him, but their input was limited. He wants to run the show, and he sees foreign policy as a series of deals in which he feels he has the upper hand because he mastered the art of the deal. And moreover, he tends to see these deals in zero-sum terms, winners and losers. We have seen his cavalier attitude towards advisors. I think that was very clear in the way he treated his intelligence chiefs. You certainly can disagree with intelligence chiefs. Every president does from time to time. You can try to manipulate them. Dick Cheney did that in the Bush administration with the results that we know. He tried to massage the intelligence so that he would get what he wanted, which was cherry-picked intelligence that claimed that Saddam Hussein still had a nuclear program, even though there was a lot of intelligence to the contrary. This we've seen before, but a public spat, and this isn't the first time, by the president with his intel chiefs basically dismissing them as naive, foolish, lazy, coming on the heels of the Helsinki summit with President Putin, in which Trump publicly said that he trusted Putin more than his intelligence agencies, sets up a situation where we know from what the president is saying that he isn't interested in his intel briefs, he doesn't want to pay attention to them, and from what we hear, he doesn't pay attention to them and often sends subordinates to these briefs, which presidents used to listen to every day or almost every day. So you have a president who wants to act solo. You have a president who churns his chief national security advisors. I don't need to go through the list to you. Tillerson, who was a lousy Secretary of State. But from Tillerson to Mattis, who did a reasonably good job but was fired, and in between, McMaster, we know he picks people not, for odd reasons. At one point he liked generals, now he isn't fond of generals. He says he knows more than generals. So the choices are made for odd reasons, but now there is a team that simply is it's not just not up to the task, but I think is a threat to the task. A Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who is not a stupid man, but who has turned out to be a sycophant. It seems as if Pompeo, whether because he knows it would be useless or because he has further aspirations that he wants Trump's help on, is simply becoming a yes man. Then you have John Bolton, who has a very clear agenda and is trying to pull the president towards it. His agenda is to the right of President Trump. John Bolton is a man who believes fervently in regime change. He believes in Iran regime change. He, as somebody who probably, if asked, would bill himself as a realist, he is tremendously unrealistic when it comes to Iran. Attending a conference in Paris run by the MEK, an Iranian opposition group that anyone who knows anything about Iran knows has zero credibility inside Iran and is sort of a cult. The reason that the MEK, I'll throw this in now, I'll come back to Iran, but since I'm mentioning the MEK, because this group's name will come up again, because this is the group that Bolton thinks is going to take over when the Iranian people rise up, and probably is filling Trump's ear with this. He does get to speak to Trump. The MEK is an opposition group that is a cult. It's a sort of started as a semi-Maoist cult, and it was based in Iraq and fought with Saddam Hussein against Iran during the 10-year Iran-Iraq war, in which several 100,000 Iranians died. So you can imagine what kind of a reputation the MEK has inside Iran. And yet, this is the group that Bolton went and spoke to. And by the way, many US unwitting politicians have spoken at MEK affairs because they get paid high honorariums, around $25,000, $30,000, and first-class plane tickets. Even Ed Rendell did once, which shows you. So there is Bolton, who is an uber hawk pushing for regime change. There is Pompeo, the sycophant. You now have a Boeing executive who has back-ended into being Secretary of Defense. We don't know how long he'll last. He was the deputy, Mattis quit. He's not a policy person. Basically, you have a situation where there's no coherence. Bolton has abandoned having National Security Council meetings of principles, which was supposed to be aimed at bringing together a unified position from intelligence, from the different agencies, and presenting options to the president. That doesn't exist. Bolton is going solo. Sometimes Trump listens to him, sometimes he doesn't. Pompeo is a sycophant. We have arrived at a situation where you have the man who thinks he is a stable genius, knows more than his generals, and is brilliant, is running the show. And he is running the show with symmetry. He believes that everything can be solved with symmetry. And so we have summits upcoming this year, which you will all be watching and should, with Xi Jinping coming up soon, because we have, as you know, an ongoing trade war. We also have a very, very dramatic technology war going on with China, which I'll come back to also. And we have military issues with China. When Trump came into office, everyone thought that the clash between the US and China, the most likely place for it was in the South China Sea, which is a major international waterway for a huge percentage of the world's trade. And China is militarizing it, even though Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago, when he first met Trump, said he would not militarize it. China is taking shoals, dumping tons of earth, rocks, building them out, and building airstrips on them, even though the sea is surrounded by many other South Asian countries, and Southeast Asian. And everyone thought that this is where Trump was going to take a stand, but his focus has been elsewhere. So there are all these huge issues, and Trump thinks that he's going to solve it with another summit. Again, I'm going to come back. We are having a summit soon with Kim Jong-un, a second summit. No progress has been made since the first on denuclearization, but Trump thinks he can solve it with a second summit. Trump is yearning for another summit with Putin. And after the famous or infamous Helsinki summit, where he met for 2 hours and took the translator's notes, and nobody knows what was said, including his intel chiefs, he wants another summit. Politics dictated that one not be held, but I think once the Mueller report is issued, and assuming, as I do, that it's not going to get Trump, we'll probably have more summitry there. So personal deal-making, which so far, in every one of these summits held so far, has gotten nowhere, except for what Trump says is his wonderful relationships with Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un. And I think he thinks he would have had a wonderful relationship with Putin if it wasn't for the witch hunt of the Mueller investigation. So personal diplomacy, and the other characteristic that you have to be aware of this coming year is the Trump belief that alliances are dispensable and that treaties are likewise, and that arms control treaties are best if ignored and withdrawn from. And that's a very strong position of John Bolton's. So you have a situation where, as you know, Trump has behaved very disdainfully towards NATO, has cheered on Brexit, has expressed admiration for governments in Europe which are on the far right and want to break the European Union, which has problems, but things would not be better for the United States or for Europe if it crumbled. And this is fine with the president, and we still have hanging over NATO the question of whether Trump would honor its critical base. The Rock of Gibraltar of NATO is Article 5, which says if any one member is attacked, the organization comes to their defense. And it is still very unclear, for example, if Russia attacked one of the Baltic states, whether the president would be willing to defend. Probably Russia is too clever to do it directly. They tried to undermine from within. But still, NATO's credibility is based on the belief that the United States stands behind it, and Trump has weakened that. Arms control treaties, as you probably have read, the U.S. has just announced it's pulling out. This will be final in 6 months, of one of the basic arms control treaties with Russia. It appears Russia did violate it, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, but instead of trying to renegotiate a tighter deal, the U.S. is set on a path to exit. The U.S. withdrew from the arms treaty with Iran. Again, an imperfect deal. I think it would have been far better to stay in, and along with the Europeans, who are anxious to do so, to try to push Iran into negotiating a better follow-on deal in the areas that were not handled tightly enough in the first treaty. No, we withdrew. So we have a president who acts solo, who disdains international alliances, and I'll touch on this again in a minute, but who is not averse to bringing troops back from South Korea, who wants to shrink America's footprint, charge the allies more for any help we give them, and if he's not satisfied, since it's all about money and deals, abandon those treaties. America solo, Trump in charge. Okay, what does the picture look like then in the areas that I think will be most challenging in 2019. I agree with the intelligence chiefs that the biggest threat facing the United States today is cyber war and cyber espionage. This is not just the kind of cyber war that Russia waged in the elections, where you put out false stuff on social media. Even that aspect of cyber war is becoming far more dangerous, even as we speak. You may have seen the phrase deep fakes. Well, we are getting to the point with technological means where you could have a video of, pick your politician, Dan Coates, the Director of National Intelligence, and words could be put in his mouth that would sound so realistic, or he could be put into another video doing things that would look so realistic that you simply cannot tell it from a fake. I mean, we are going into a technological realm where foreign adversaries who want to sow discord have access to technology and will increasingly have access to more that will exponentially increase the risks of what can be done to disrupt democracies, to undermine elections, to cripple systems. And right now, although individual agencies, whether it's Homeland Security and our CIA and our intel agencies are all working on this, they are not working in a coordinated fashion directed from the White House, because one of the first things that the president did was to abolish the office that coordinated the pushback against cyber espionage. And that office has not been reinstated or a new person appointed. And the importance of having a whole of government approach to this is that even if the agencies are not completely in silos, if you don't have an attempt at the top, not an attempt, a commitment, to get all of these agencies coordinated and working on the key issues, then you can have people slipping by the key problems. You may recall that before 9/11, Richard Clark, the National Security Advisor, warned Condoleezza Rice that they were afraid that you could have an attack on the World Trade Center. There had been one some years earlier, and there was a fear they could try again, but it wasn't taken seriously. And then we found out too late that the CIA and the FBI were not coordinating, and if they had combined their intelligence, they would have identified several of the hijackers who were in the States. The CIA and the FBI are doing better now, but the issue has become so much bigger in terms of intelligence, information wars, that you need coordination from the top, not only all of government, but between the private sector and the government, because the private sector with Facebook, with Twitter, et cetera, is a critical part of the fight, and there has to be coordination. Trump is not doing it. He sees anything that smacks of such a war, it appears that he sees it as somehow a slap at him because of the 2016 election. He can only see it through that prism. He cannot see it as the most pressing, immediate threat facing the United States. But the threat goes beyond that. You may have read in the papers about Huawei, Huawei, the phone company in China, and the fact that the United States is pressing allies not to buy Huawei technology for their phone systems and for the software to underlie 5G. 5G, the new architecture of computing, which is mega times as fast as what we do now, which is coming online soon. Everybody is setting up the underlying architecture, and the US, with good reason, is worried that Huawei, which is nominally a private Chinese company, if allowed to install all the switches, the systems, the chips, will be a backdoor for the Chinese military to basically have intelligence on everything in the West, because Chinese current government of Xi Jinping has put forward laws that require private companies to share their technological data with the military when it is considered of national security interest. So there's no such thing as a private company in China. I've been on the Huawei campus, which is in southern China, in Shenzhen. I haven't been on the Microsoft campus, but it looks like what I imagine the main Microsoft campus, tens of thousands of young people, all in khakis and T-shirts, except they're all Chinese, maybe only half Chinese at Microsoft, but going to and fro between the buildings or filing into 9 restaurants in a system that gets them in and out in a half an hour, 2,000 at lunchtime. And the Huawei phones are spectacular, really better than the iPhone. The clarity, the photographs, it's really top-level technology. So this is a very tricky issue. And this is a war that is going to heat up in this coming year. So the techno wars are heating up. The question is whether the president is up to waging them, and whether he will do so in a way that is adequate to deal with this emerging threat. I should add here that in order to do so, he needs cooperation from the Europeans, he needs cooperation from the Japanese and our Asian allies, because if they are going to choose not to buy Huawei technology, this is going to anger China. So they have to feel they're in an alliance with the United States, and that Trump has their back, and that other factors are being considered. If you alienate all your allies, it makes it harder to stand together against the new threats. So let me segue into the new threats to look for in 2019, which I've started talking about. Beyond cyber, let me take a little bit more of a look at China. As you know, we're engaged in a trade war with China. Now, I was just in China in October, and the fascinating thing to me, one of the many fascinating things, was that the American business community, and they're represented by AmCham, the American Chamber of Commerce, which has big offices in Beijing and in Shanghai, and the board of AmCham in China is usually made up of retired CEOs and former commerce top officials at the US Embassy or in Washington. So a very solid group of businessmen who are involved with AmCham. In all the years I've been going to China, until 2016, when you talk to AmCham people, they would always say, yes, China, there's problems, it's real trouble getting into Chinese markets, but we have to give it time. The first time I heard AmCham people really getting angry was in 2016. This time when I was in China, AmCham people were boiling. And the reason is because businesses, American businesses, have practically given up that China will ever play on a level playing field with American firms that are trying to penetrate the Chinese market. The Chinese steal technology, the Chinese forced transfer of technology, it is really true. Trump says it, but it's also true. What they do is they make American companies take part in a joint venture with a Chinese company, which is usually partly state-owned. And as a price of admission, they make the American half turn over key technology. Then they take that key technology and they give it to a Chinese company that is building itself to compete with the American company that has just got, and in the meantime, they set up rules and regulations that make it hard, if not impossible, for the American company to really penetrate the Chinese market. And then by the time they loosen up a little, the Chinese company has produced a product that's competitive, and they've taken over the Chinese market. And this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much. So there is a real problem with China, with markets. But again, Trump should have approached this in cooperation. What time do we say? All right. I'm going to go a little faster. Trump should have approached this in cooperation with our European and Asian allies. He didn't. So now you have to watch. Is this trade war going to be resolved in any way? Is China going to give in to the master of the art of the deal? Or is it going to become more tense with, as of March, tariffs on Chinese goods going up to 25% from 10%, which will have a major impact in this country? Is there, if this tension between us and China increases, how will that play out in the military realm? And the war over Huawei. China realizes we're at war with one of their biggest, most powerful technology firms. Not only that, but Canada, at the US request, arrested one of their executives in Canada, who was in Canada visiting, and the US wants her extradited to the US. So the tensions between the US and China are only going to grow. The thing that you should watch for here is whether Trump caves and calls it a victory. What he might do, China has offered to buy a lot more soybeans and a lot more goods. Now, that will be very nice for soybean farmers, but it won't affect these structural problems where China basically makes it impossible for Americans to get into the market and takes the technology. If those are not addressed, then things will continue to fester. Trump says he's going to hold on, but if he holds on, it'll have one set of consequences and will be more tense with China. If he concedes so that he can declare victory before the 2020 elections, that's another set of problems because, China will keep on doing what they're doing. The technology war will continue, and eventually, further clashes will come. So, I would say China, next to cyber wars, which China is part of, is the number one issue on the horizon, and there's no good solution. I would tend to bet that Trump will cave, but the problems won't go away, and more will bubble up, and Trump's one-on-one with Xi Jinping is not going to solve the world. And then I'll just, mention a couple of the other key things that I think you should be looking at. One is obviously North Korea. Another summit with Kim Jong-un, who Trump said he loves. There's been zero progress on denuclearization. Kim is playing Trump like a violin. It is true that there are no more threats, but those threats were mutual. It is true that Kim stopped his missile testing and has not tested nuclear weapons. However, Kim said back at the end of 2017, I believe, or it might have been in 2018, that he had done enough tests for now. They didn't need to do more testing. And the facility that he has offered to decommission, one nuclear plutonium-producing facility, this facility has been decommissioned before and then recommissioned. So, this is no solution to anything. And plus, there are secret uranium-producing facilities that America still doesn't even know where they are, and North Korea isn't telling them. So what do you watch for with North Korea, and when could it get more dangerous? You watch to see again whether Trump caves. It may well be that Trump decides that he has to make more concessions and say he's winning. And what Kim Jong-un is going to ask for is that Trump make a peace declaration and facilitate a movement towards a final peace settlement between North and South Korea. That sounds very nice. There never has been one since the Korean War. It's a state of armistice that is administered by the United Nations. the problem with this nice sounding solution is that Kim will charge a price. He wants American troops to leave South Korea. And it is possible that Trump, who wants all the troops to come home from everywhere, and who is asking the South Koreans to increase by 50% the already hefty amount of money they pay the U.S. annually for U.S. to keep troops there, it may be that Trump will say yes. And if he says yes, then we are on the way to a Korea that is dominated by China and North Korea. And a situation where Japan may well decide it has to develop nuclear weapons if the American nuclear umbrella goes home. And we still will face a North Korea that has its full arsenal and is a nuclear threat, even if Kim and Trump say they love each other. So the second summit, will Trump cave? And then, I'm just going to list through some others which you are welcome to ask me about, and then I'll stop talking so that you can ask questions. I mean, Afghanistan and Syria, pulling troops out. This is, I take very personally because I spent an awful lot of time in Afghanistan and Iraq. I've been in northern Syria where the Kurds are, year before last. I think it's worth the U.S. keeping troops there, not for victory, but because it is a cheap, symbolic indicator that the United States is still paying attention to the outcome in those countries, wants an influential seat at the negotiating table when there's ever serious negotiations about the future of Syria, and doesn't abandon allies, i.e. the Kurds. In Afghanistan, what it looks like is about to happen is the abandonment of Afghanistan, sort of like 1973 with Vietnam, as Ryan Crocker, the former ambassador to Afghanistan, said, putting lipstick on a pig to disguise the defeat. I think it would be worth keeping the troops in Afghanistan, and because the minute you take them out, the Taliban sort of moves in, and not only is everything that we have done so far for naught, but all the women that we encouraged to set up shelters, to go to school, so forth, are toast. And one of those women has appeared here in Scranton, Soraya Paksad, who runs shelters for battered women in Herat. I have visited her shelters in Herat, Afghanistan, which is near the Iranian border. And these women will not survive unless we let them in. And you know something? We won't let them in. We may provide a few visas, just like Congress provided visas for Afghans who worked as translators with our troops. And you know what? Those Afghans are not getting those visas. Even Iraqis who worked with our military, there's still some who are not getting their visas. And their families who are under death threat are not getting their visas. So let us not fool ourselves. We encourage those women, and we are leaving them to disaster. And so I feel very strongly about it. It's not an immediate threat to our security. I think it's a challenge to our morality and to who we are as Americans. And frankly, it makes me sick. But so watch and see what happens. And maybe in Scranton you can wage a campaign for Soraya Paksad. I mean, it's getting to the point where, if you save one, it seems like the best you can do. And that's why I have written a column saying I'm opposed to the U.S. being in the forefront for regime change in Venezuela, because Venezuela is a failed state. This very handsome young Guaido is a weak read in terms of facing the military. I mean, because he doesn't have the troops and the 100,000 armed militiamen that stand with Maduro. I'm not for Maduro, but it just bothers me to see the U.S. rush out in front of open push for regime change when there is no sign that we are going to do the necessary if Maduro should leave and prevent this country from falling into civil war and economic collapse. Even the oil industry is totally degraded. It will take years for it to recover, take a huge amount of capital. Is the U.S. going to put the capital in? No. My guess would be that President Trump would say they should pay us because they have oil. Or maybe, as he keeps saying still about Iraq, they should give us the oil. So that's why I'm cynical about it. But so I think I've given you a sufficient list of potential things to watch for in 2019, and I'm going to stop there and take your questions. Sandra has a pressing question.
Yeah, Russia. Can you say a little bit more about the relationship with Putin?
Right, relationship with Russia. You know, what bothers me most about the relationship with Russia is there are issues on which, with deep skepticism, with sufficient distrust and mistrust, it would not hurt us to sit down with Russia. Those include Afghanistan and Syria. However, because Trump refuses to admit that Russia meddled in 2016, he set up the political situation in which it is impossible for us to have a rational, productive conversation with Russia. So instead, we have these secret conversations where, as you know, he met on the sidelines of another conference, not Helsinki, and spoke for 15 minutes with only Melania present, not even a US translator. And we don't know what he said in Helsinki. I see the future of the US-Russian relationship, and I'm not speaking to what Mueller is going to find. I think we know what he's going to find, that there were people in the campaign who were very happy to try to get stuff out of Russia that they knew was illegal, and some of them are already in jail, and maybe more will go. I think it's going to be very hard to nail President Trump on this. But in the future, the relationship is simply going to be one where President Putin tries to poke his finger in the eye of the Americans and do everything possible to embarrass, undermine, sow dissent. However, I will say, and also in Europe, I will say, however, and it must be said, that the reason Russia could interfere so easily in 2016, and the reason why it's so even more simple for them to intervene now than then, is that it was easy then because we weren't prepared, and it's easier now because President Trump aids and abets, not in terms of collusion, but simply in terms of repeating or encouraging the kinds of storylines that Russian trolls spread in the media. Often stuff that comes out of RT, Russia Today, their overseas broadcasting, or out of Russian trolls, is simply repeated. Donald Jr. tweets it to his following. It is repeated wholesale. It's picked up by Breitbart or by InfoWars, and then it becomes part of the memes that travel on the alt-right internet. And nobody checks. When I was in Russia in April, and I talked to all of the handful of very brave journalists who have covered the famous troll factory in St. Petersburg, and I went to the troll factory, but I couldn't get in. But I talked to people who had worked there. I talked to all the journalists who've written about it since 2015, and they all said the same thing to me. Well, you make it so easy. You know, why are you so upset about this? You know, you opened your arm, and now Trump opens his arm, and Breitbart opens his arm. So Russian trolling is as much a creature of us as it is of them. But beyond that, Russia will poke and prod in Europe, wherever they can, to try to encourage illiberal democracies that are pro-Russian. There is already one in Italy, very pro-Russian. Hungary, very pro-Russian. They are meddling in the Baltics. They are meddling, not in the Baltics, in the Balkans, in Serbia, in Montenegro. They will try to make trouble in the Baltics. Russian television is widely watched in the Baltics, where there's a lot of Russian speakers. And the line on RT, and even regular Russian TV, which can be seen there, is 180 degrees different from anything you'll hear on Western TV. And it is outrageously conspiratorial. When you're in Moscow and you turn on one of the talk shows, you think Sean Hannity is, astonishingly outrageous. You have heard nothing to the conspiracy theories which are promoted on Russian television about American behavior, American intentions, what's up, what's down, who's good, who's bad. And so that will continue. Putin thinks America is on the way down, and he wants to accelerate it. And that is what I was told by Russian foreign policy experts, 201, both pro-Putin and anti-Putin, in Moscow. So I think that's what we can expect. I don't see outright clashes. If U.S. stands up to Putin, he backs off. The potential clash is in Ukraine. Trump would like to ignore Ukraine. Fortunately, that's one issue where Congress supports giving defensive weapons, and that's why they were given, not because Trump wanted to. At the Republican convention in 2016, his people took aid to Ukraine out of the Republican Party platform. But in Congress, there are GOP hawks, and in this case, I'm with them, who don't like Russian meddling in Ukraine. So there may be some pushback there, but Putin will go as far as he thinks he can get away with. Help Brexit, harm Macron, help Le Pen, help Salvini. There are European Parliament elections in May. I'm going to Italy before that, and to France. This is my hardship duty, better than going to Syria and Iraq. Because the far-right parties are going to try to take over the European Parliament, and if they can change the bylaws, and another nail in the coffin if the EU, if they succeed. So it's going to be, usually the EU elections, who cares? But in this case, it's going to really align those who support liberal values, not in the sense of liberal economics, but in terms of democratic liberal values versus illiberal values like Hungary, where the leader of Hungary has taken over the media, taken over the courts, is wildly pro-Putin. So it's going to be a very interesting moment for Europe.
Okay.
Questions?
Questions?
Trudy, today the New York Times has a gigantic editorial out.
On Afghanistan.
I don't know if you saw it yet.
Today?
Today.
Yeah, on Afghanistan.
About leaving Afghanistan. Did you read it?
Yeah, we got a boom just in case. Yeah, I read it on the way here, actually, yeah.
What did you think of it?
I don't know if you heard the question. The New York Times has a half-a-page editorial today on why we should get out of Afghanistan. The thing that fascinated me about it is, the first 2/3 were about how this was a failed war. We've been in there, we spent this much, we blah, blah, blah. And then at the very end, there's one sentence about, yes, it'll probably be bad for women. And then there's another sentence about, yes, it probably means that the Taliban will take over, sort of towards the end there. I think the Times editorial failed to face up to the moral issues. They could still make the same case. But if you're going to make the case for leaving, you have to face up to what it means. And to me, I see it as a long-term investment. It'll be a stalemate if we kept the troops there. But all right, you had, I think, 2 U.S. troops died last year. And I think they mentioned it in the editorial. That is tragic, but we have a professional army. I mean, people die in car accidents. To me, holding Kabul and keeping the Taliban from taking full control is worth a long-term investment. Because, first of all, how do you know that we can trust them not to incubate other terrorist groups? But secondly, it sends a message. It sends an incredible message that the U.S. is giving up in its stand against radical Islamic governments. The Taliban are a radical Islamic government. The U.S. takes a strong stand against the Muslim Brotherhood, which was in power in Egypt. A woman I admire was the U.S. ambassador to Egypt at that time. And the Muslim Brotherhood government won an election. She was sort of blackballed for a future job because she talked to them. She was supposed to be Mattis's deputy, and the Republicans in Congress made it known that they wouldn't confirm her because she dealt with the Muslim Brothers. Muslim Brothers are, cuddly bears compared with the Taliban. The Muslim Brothers are for education. So it says something about the weariness, the retreat, and the failure. And yes, there is failure, but for me, to keep 14,000 troops there and wait and see what the situation is, see if there's a better kind of negotiation, if we were serious about it, see if you could have a negotiation, but keep those troops there as the price to the Taliban for becoming a political party, one of many. But a pullout, rushing for the exits, to me, I didn't buy the editorial. I thought that they were not sufficiently honest. Mark.
Yeah, Trudy, you sufficiently increased my anxiety, which I thought was at zenith. But I want to ask you, how about telling us about something good?
Something good. I was having dinner with a Russian oligarch last week, who happens to be Armenian, married to a Jew, so a nice Russian oligarch. And he has just started a charity to give awards to humanitarians who have done incredible work that goes under the radar screen of the media and NGOs. And he said to me, don't you want to write about doing something good here? Let me tell you about our new charity. When it comes to a bigger global scale, of course you can find, there's medical advances, but we are in, as I said, this complicated transition in which the leadership in the West is not stellar, to put it mildly, in which democracies are losing confidence in themselves, in which democracies are losing wars, in which Trump comes across as a bully, and in which the regime with the most self-confidence is China. Putin is clever. I think he knows how weak his country is, tremendously weak. Population figures, demographics are terrible, the population's shrinking, births are falling. Even though they're floating on a tide of oil, the economy simply does not take off because of all kinds of structural flaws and repressions. He has a certain amount of self-confidence. I think he's convinced himself, but the Chinese really believe it's their century. And I think, it's like, unless we get our own mojo back, unless, our grandchildren or children have the same faith in democracy that baby boomers did, who came of age in the John F. Kennedy era and believed in, ask not what your country can do for you. When you believe in yourself, then more optimistic things can happen, I think. And so it's a bad time for optimism. I wish I could find someone. If any of you have some optimistic ideas for columns, my email address is at the bottom of my column. You can get it online, and please send them to me, because I find I find it hard. You know, you could write glowing columns about the bravery of Afghan women like Soraya, who still run these shelters, about Saudi women who led the driving campaign, and they're now being tortured in jail by this hideous creature, Mohammed bin Salman, who's the buddy of Jared Kushner, and who Pompeo is photographed grinning next to like a Cheshire cat, and nobody brings up the women. I mean, I wrote about them, Nick Kristof just wrote about them, others will write about them. The sister of one of the women, I think sister or cousin, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. The leader of the driving campaign, and tortured with electric shocks, beaten, threatened with rape, in prison by the man, Mr. Katani, who was in charge of the Khashoggi killing. He's the right-hand consigliere of Mohammed bin Sultan, and although he's technically been fired, he's still by his side. And so it's hard to be optimistic. I wish I could. You know, we can be optimistic about our families. Kids, grandkids, get into good schools. Yippee. Back there. Oh, sorry. All right, we'll go here and then there, and then you tell me when to end.
I have two questions. First, it's hard for Australians to take seriously Americans picking a fight with them. How long do you think it will take for America's international standing to recover after Trump, or do you think the damage he's doing is irreparable? And the second question is, who do you think will be the target of the wag the dog this year?
Well, you know, I'll just say the second, you know, I wrote a column about Venezuela last week, and I was talking about, you know, why now? And of course, one of the hypotheticals is that it's a wag the dog. Although frankly, I don't know that Americans, except for Cubans in Miami, I don't know that Americans care enough about Venezuela for it to be a wag the dog, and plus which, I don't think Trump thinks he needs a wag the dog. I mean, he talks to his base, and his base is with him no matter what he does. So, you know, I don't think wag the dog actually is the operative issue here. Whether the U.S. can recover, I think, depends on two things. One, if Trump does not get a second term. And two, which is the bookend, if the Democrats come up with a really stellar candidate. And if number two doesn't happen, and so far I don't see that stellar candidate, then we'll get a second term of Trump, and then it'll be very hard to recover, I think. There was a gentleman in the back that yeah.
There was a recent report in 18, I think it was probably for Mr. Woodward's book, where White House aides would remove documents from the president's desk before he could sign these policy initiatives. And recently I read a report of the president talking with General Mattis, profanity-laden directive that he wanted Assad assassinated and other people. And Mr. Mattis said, sure, I'll take care of that, and then hung up and said there was people around him, we're not going to do that. But now General Kelly and General Mattis are gone. My question is, are there people in the government, the White House, in the Defense Department that are there that are going to protect us?
Well, I tried to address that at the beginning. I don't see it. I mean, I think that definitely Mattis, to a lesser extent, on occasion, Kelly, to an even lesser extent, General McMaster, but sometimes, there were influences, and they're gone. And, you know, as I said, Pompeo's a yes man, and Bolton is more aggressive overseas. So, you know, I think Trump has warring instincts. On the one hand, he wants to bring the troops home. On the other hand, if somebody tells him it's easy to do regime change and it'll make him look like macho man, I think he's very open to it. So you have push-pull. I mean, you know, I think in the case of Venezuela, Rubio had a lot of influence. amazingly, given their previous relationship. If the Times is to be believed, I mean, I don't have personal knowledge on this, but you may have seen a big piece in the Times saying that Rubio has been talking to Trump about this for months, and Bolton, I think, would see this as a test run for Iran, because the effort is to use all kinds of new and draconian economic sanctions to make the military change their mind because they're not getting paid. I don't think it's going to work, but who knows? But so you don't have any check. You have somebody who's more egregiously aggressive and somebody who's a yes man, Pompeo. And other than that, who does he listen to? So that's why I brought that up as, one of the biggest threats in 2019. I should just mention, you have some GOP senators, but I don't think it's going to have that much impact. And you have now House committees, which are run by Democrats. I think that will be good for getting information out in hearings, but I don't think it can necessarily stop anything from happening.
I was going to ask about the 2018 election and if you saw a glimmer of hope in that.
The 2018, the by-election.
The Congress.
Well, again, if the critical, of course there was hope in the 2018 congressional elections because it showed that there's a swing population, even including areas that had voted for Trump, that is tiring of him. But we don't know for sure how that translates into electoral college politics. You can get umpteen seats in California, but you can only carry California once for the electoral college. And then, the second thing is, I think that election showed how split the Democratic Party is between so-called progressives and centrists. I happen to be in the centrist camp. I think a lot of things that progressives say are good, but I think, we're not going to get Medicare for all. You have to decide what you're going to hit at. Your main theme in a campaign can't be Me Too. If you only have women vote, you're not going to win. There's a lot of common sense things that are not considered common sense anymore. And again, it depends on whether the Democratic Party can build bridges within itself. And I think if they don't nominate a centrist who's attractive, I'm not looking, that doesn't even raise the question of Joe Biden, which I won't get into unless somebody asks, but if they don't find the right candidate, and if the party divides itself, let alone if Howard Schultz really runs, then the Democratic Party will lose.
Well, it's 1:30.
Okay, witching hour. Thank you.